Now, I think that actually this a question of gender studies, women's studies, the distinction is being sought by sort of reflecting backwards rather than posed at the time when we began to write histories, which were, in a sense, bringing women back into the historical framework. I think that different people have different. I'm not even sure that everybody has been very mindfully using the term women's history versus gender history, or gender studies versus women's studies. Sometimes they have. Sometimes departments have just felt more comfortable calling themselves women's studies departments, and that's what we began with. And sometimes they wanted to give it the kind of, let's say, a gloss in which they put in gender, because gender is something that seems to be less confrontational to some people than women's history, because women's history then is positioned against the way in which history has been written, in which women have been excised from history. So I think that part of the reason why there is this, what would you call it, use of women's studies versus gender studies is depending upon which configuration of forces is working to say what they want to do. One of the things that people have done is to consider that gender is more inclusive, because you can actually do a lot of masculinity studies under gender studies. You can also do, and now because gender has been unfixed as a category, it allows, it appears to some people to allow, bringing in certain other ways of looking at disciplines or issues, and that is, it's easier to queer gender studies than it is to queer women's history, because women's history is seen as being somewhat fixed. So I don't see this as a very strong thing for me to get worked up about. I think we used women's studies and women's history because that is the way in which history had come down to us, with the exclusion of women in history. And so when we began to ask our questions, we were asking really the question of, does this history, is it inclusive of the experience of women and their concerns and their issues and so on? So I think that's how the opening of this question, perhaps as two separate distinctions, are concerned. I know that some people have considered women's studies to be more political than gender studies. Now, why they do that, I'm not sure. But I've heard people saying, let's use gender studies, and feeling more comfortable with that. So I myself don't take a strong position on these two. I have historically used women's studies more than gender studies. Now, this is a question that actually could be framed precisely like this for anyone telling the history of any margins. So if I were to say, for instance, how will I write the history of laboring communities, of laboring groups? This would be the same kind of challenge, because just as today, in the past too, the framework of knowledge has been heavily shaped or dominated by those who are powerful, and obviously then the manner in which they leave sources behind is highly one could call it controlled on the one hand, or you could say highly exclusivist on in some ways, because it has actually told the stories of people who have been in power. Now, historically, since women were not in power, or all marginal groups have not been in power, actually we share similar characteristics. That is, for instance, if I were to say, how will I write the history of the Dasa Karmakaras, that is the categories of people who labored in early India, I would have the same problems, because the sources would be dominated by the concerns of the hegemonic writers of those texts, which has been highly skewed. So how much space are you going to get for the Dasakarmarkaras in Manu's text? Or how much are you going to get necessarily? You'll get some in the Vedic corpus, but it's unlikely that you're going to get a great deal of material. So in a sense, what I'm saying is that the challenge of writing women's history is actually the same kind of challenge that comes from anyone who wants to write the history of the margins, because the sources are dominated by the viewpoint and concerns of those who are in power. Let me give you an example. For instance, one of the earliest sources that we can treat as historical, and it's outside the Sanskritic model. Let me also point out that not every Sanskritic models are overwhelming in the way in which you framed it. I think it's, or people frame it, but there are sources, there are other sources, there are Prakrit sources, there are Pali sources, there are Buddhist sources. There is inscriptional evidence, which are not outside the framework of power, but which are certainly outside of the Sanskritic model, as it were. Now, if you look at the inscriptions, Ashokan inscriptions, you'll find that the concerns, what are the concerns? This is a king trying to speak to his people. So he is positioning himself as someone who wields power. And he's now trying to reformulate the basis of power. So he's actually leaving those inscriptions behind in very, very significant ways. So there are references. Now, even there is a reference to the working classes, the Dasabhrityas. Occasionally, there's a reference to women. But by and large, it is the king speaking to his people, and his people are ordinary people. It includes ordinary people. So there is a limitation. Now, of course, there is a limitation as far as sources are concerned. As I said, if you look at, say, for instance, open the newspaper, even today, you'll find it dominated by, stories of those who are in power or those who are fighting wars and whatever it is. And this classically excludes actually the framework or the experience of people who are subject to power rather than wielders of power. So to that extent, I think the sources being, we're not having a range of sources, because these are the classes, these are the categories of people who were excluded from learning, who have certainly not been able to leave their own sources behind, their own viewpoint behind, except as it's written by the more dominant sources. So sometimes you get it as a reaction. Now, one of my interactions with Gerda Lerner, who is a doyen of the women's history, was to say, look at the silences or the speech, that is the excessive speech that you find, and you'll find that the sources actually reveal why, suddenly out of the blue, why do you have suddenly a codification of the laws? Now that codification of the laws is coming from those who rule, but there's a certain point in the unfolding of history in which these codifications are brought in. Why were the Dharma Sutras written at a certain point of time, the Dharma Shastras written at a certain point of time? It is because you are actually trying to regulate social life in particular ways. And you need to intervene to shape the way in which you are going to wield power over these categories of people. So if I suddenly start to say, there's a great deal of, there's Kali Yuga over here, why is there so much concern with the Kali Yuga? That is, and then it says people, what are the two things that they define as characteristics of Kali Yuga? One is that the Shudras are not obeying their orders, and that women are also not, in a sense, not conforming to the rules. Now, you can immediately see that this is the basis for the hammering home of certain kinds of rules, normative regulations, which is going to then ensure that that society will conform to the viewpoint and the ideology of the dominant. So there are ways in which you can uncover and read history against the grain, as it were, because that's one of the things. We are in a difficult situation in India, more so than any other region, because here we did not use inscriptions in the same way as, say, Mesopotamia or China or Egypt did. I think we are, in fact, our earliest written form has not even been deciphered as yet. So there is a challenge. There's definitely a challenge. But there are ways in which we can still do that history. And I don't think we can use the argument that you can qualify what you're saying and make it evident to the reader that there is a difficulty in writing thick history of certain in certain ways. But that's a challenge that I think many societies will have, and you'll have to deal with it, because by and large, as I said, if you look at the newspaper even today, where are the stories of the food shortages? And there was a time during the pandemic when suddenly labor entered the framework. But by and large, who's interested in the history of laboring groups? Or women will come in, but only as objects of violence. So in a sense, a very narrowed way, in any case, that even today's sources are going to be come down to us, to the next generation in history. So let me start with the second part of it. I think it's critical to study gender and caste together, because I don't think you understand gender in India or South Asia without understanding caste. And equally, you do not understand caste without understanding the manner in which gender codes are framed in South Asia. So it seems to me that, and the point is that here there is the rules and regulations and the structure of inequality in which caste and gender are critical axes are coming to us in an almost conjoint way. And we cannot understand one without looking at the other. The mistake people have done, and particularly sociologists, is that they have studied class, and activists have also done that, or you've studied caste because they're all concerned with caste, but they've actually, and very late in life, questions of gender came in, but they didn't actually put the structure together, the structure of inequality in South Asia, to my mind. And I think that even other parts of outside of formal India today are shaped by similar kinds of ideologies. So it is impossible. One of the important things from my point of view was to push the understanding in a way in which you did not separate so strongly. It's not that you can't analytically separate, but you can't, that you separate it so much that there is no relationship between the two that you can actually draw, and that it is left for us feminist historians and feminist analysts to bring those two together. Because it isn't as if, say, people had not done kinship, or they hadn't done to an extent, women's participation in this and that and the other, or they hadn't done caste and ritual purity and stuff like that by themselves. But the fact is that they had, what was not brought together was the working of the two together in a conjoint way. Now, this realization, this realization hit me quite strong. I mean, I don't know when I became sensitive to it, but it was clearly the Mandal agitation that actually generated critically the need to look at caste and gender together. Now, I want to make a substantial point here, which is that this historian, feminist or not, does not work in isolation, does not work with a, oh, now I know it, I need to do a PhD thesis. So let me think of a theme. When you think of a theme, you're already thinking of a theme that is going to be speaking to you. Otherwise, you can't do meaningful research. So when you search for a theme to research, you are already going to go into that field because there is a certain, let's say, set of concerns that are circulating around you as an individual, the way you are shaped, but also as a society and what it's raising at that point of time. So I do believe that it's a lot of my writing, at least, has been shaped by my own relationship to my society and the kind of concerns that I felt were necessary to be able to do a good piece of academic work. So, for instance, my first piece of work may appear to be something which is on religion or on which is on Buddhism, but it was critical for me to do that piece of work because I was being shaped by precisely similar kinds of questions raised from the time of Ambedkar, who had made this declaration when I was only 15, when he said, I may have been born a Hindu, but I will not die a Hindu. And then he converted just 3 months before he actually passed away. So that, which sent shockwaves in traditional communities, because they said, why do you need to do that? And even the president of the country, Radhakrishnan, had actually framed the Buddhism within Hinduism. There's a famous statement he makes in the book where he wrote the foreword called 2,500 Years of Buddhism. And he calls it he says, Buddha was born a Hindu, he lived as a Hindu, and he died as a Hindu. Now, it is denying the understanding that the Buddha shares a history with, say, brahmanical forces around him. But he has a unique position, and that unique position cannot be enfolded within this category of Hindu. So, in a sense, those kinds of questions, which came to me finally when I did the research, they were also being articulated in my time. There was an unease with the idea that Buddhism is a distinctive body of ideas. And the more I studied the texts, the more I was convinced that there is a unique combination of ideas in the Buddha and concerns of the Buddha, which are quite distinctive. And my work led me to, my close reading of the text led me to that. So what I'm saying is that the text and context, there is texts are generated by also certain elements in the context, and at least that has been the case with me. So to return to the question of caste and gender, I was responding sharply to the violence in the public sphere around the Mandal agitation, in which young people had taken to the streets and were burning and attacking buses and so on. And young people were setting themselves on fire on the ground that we are now going to lose those jobs in the services, which is considered very important by people who know class and caste forces very well, as something that they need to control. So state and the administrative apparatus is something that people feel the privileged in our society would definitely want to control. And this was an attempt at opening it up. Now, what struck me then, and it's there in the book also that I write, is this bunch of young women who have placards which say, we don't want unemployed husbands. They are not protesting the Mandal ordinance for themselves as upper caste girls. They're protesting on behalf of their future husbands. And it struck me that what is this happening? That is, the VP Singh has given us an ordinance on who's going to get these jobs. He didn't give an ordinance saying who's going to marry whom. And why can't these girls consider, if they're so keen on being wives of civil servants, why don't they just marry these Bahujan guys who come out who are going to get the new jobs? And it's the shock of understanding how internalized the importance of caste-based marriage, endogamous marriages, that became the heart of the work that I wrote on gendering caste. So gendering caste is actually coming out of a critical contemporary moment. And then it requires one to go back and look at the entire body of writing. And I did not discover that body of writing. I mean, there are huge amounts of writing, both on caste and on gender. It is just the bringing together of the two that was my contribution in gendering caste. And I think that finally, when I wrote Brahmanical Patriarchy, which I wrote within 3 years, 1993 is when it was published in the EPW. I use this term Brahmanical Patriarchy because this is the dominant model as reflected in the Sanskrit texts, the Dharma Shastras that are coming up in the 2nd, 3rd century AD onwards. So that those texts was to me the Brahmanical Patriarchy is the kind of hegemonic understanding of the kind of patriarchy that we need, and it is strongly tinted. It's strongly stamped by caste and caste privilege and caste working, because, for instance, the same rules do not apply to women across the social hierarchy. So, what is significant about this? I mean, I use this term called Brahmanical Patriarchy. Maybe I should have used caste-based patriarchy instead. And I could have done that because my later work shows you how, other castes have also shaped normative rules for women. But I had written it as Brahmanical Patriarchy because of the hegemonic stamp on that model, and it began to circulate. In fact, it got picked up by Gail Onwet, and I just let it be. But it has come in. It remains controversial to this day because you might know that Dalit feminists in the US went to meet Jack Twitter, and they had a poster which said "Smash Brahmanical Patriarchy," and it went widely circulated on social media, and then it immediately led to a massive reaction from privileged Hindu men who were very outraged by this, and Twitter took that post down. So actually, it remains extremely, let's say, it's seen as a contested field. So I realized that I've actually done something which inadvertently, perhaps, or consciously, bringing the two together. And that itself is interesting to see how that term has stayed and circulated. And so that's the history of the use of the term Brahmanical Patriarchy. This is a good question because how do Dalit men respond to this Brahmanical Patriarchy, and how have others responded to it? Now, let me begin with the first. The others, among the others, I think have been kind of ignored by a lot of people, but except maybe feminists. One thing I want to point out is that, we feminists or gender historians write and write and write, and we don't get read by the mainstream historians. I don't believe that I have been read by even my friends and colleagues in the history department. The men tend to regard it as a kind of add-on, that this is not hard social history. In fact, there's a ancient Indian historian who actually said that that gender history was different from social history. Now, that's completely rubbish, because how can society not include gender as a category within the analysis, given the fact that the women have constituted 50% of the population at least. Yeah. So it's quite outrageous. So one problem, I think, is that men don't read dominant scholars, don't read the work of feminists. They treat it as sort of something which is like a, field which is happening on the side. If they're not antagonistic directly, they are at least ignoring it. Now, this has also meant that actually, I think the kind of dialogue that is necessary between people who write on caste, write on gender, write on social history, other social histories, that is not happening sufficiently. And we're not debating amongst ourselves. So that's a disadvantage. Now, within this framework, one of the questions that came up about brahmanical patriarchy, and then saying, using the same terminology to flip it and put it onto Dalit men. So Dalit patriarchy became then a contested situation, because Dalit patriarchy is not like, it's not like, it's shaped by Brahmanical patriarchy, because Brahmanical patriarchy has codes for everybody. But it is actually quite distinctive from the Brahmanical model, because the normative rules for the upper castes are not the normative rules for middle castes and for lower castes. So in a sense, patriarchal norms themselves are distinctive and locate distinctive for each social group. So I've written another paper which is called, I think, the ideological and material structure of widowhood in India. Because widowhood, for instance, is a completely, only the upper caste widow was banned from remarriage. Middle caste women and the lower caste women are not banned. Widows are not banned from remarriage. If anything, they are forced into remarriage in a certain kind of way, because the idea about use of sexuality and the production of laboring men is completely different in those social groups. So I don't have the time to go into this, but if people were to read the corresponding essay with Brahmanical patriarchy, you'll actually get a map of the way in which Brahmanical patriarchy organized sexuality, not only for the upper caste women, but for all sections of women. So there's a very interesting way in which this field is created. So I really think that so Dalit. So one of the reactions that came was Dalit patriarchy was Dalit patriarchy. That's not a term we should use. You should say patriarchy amongst Dalits. I think there was some discomfort with that. Actually, I don't know what, but when I was doing my MA, my graduate program, and I was a student I studied, I actually studied history on my own because I was a private candidate of the Banaras Hindu University. The course was devised by them, and our relationship with them was that they sent us the syllabus, we studied on our own, and then we went and did our exams. So clearly the field that interested me was early Indian history. So to that extent, ancient India was the field that I found myself drawn to. And then within that field, as I've pointed out in the earlier also, Buddhism really drew my interest, because I felt that here was an incredibly rich period of history in which ideas were being thrown, and people were engaging with critical issues of human existence, critical issues about what kind of society we should have, critical issues around the meaning of life. Why are we born? Why are we here? what happens to us ultimately. So philosophy and philosophical questions were at their peak in this 6th to 4th century BC in early India. And I found that period really exciting because there was there was such a freshness to the questions. Take, for instance, the Charavaks, who have been, unfortunately, the Charavaks or the Lokayatas, they have not, their texts have not got left behind. So their ideas have got left behind in the texts of their opponents. So you don't get the actual richness of their own thinking. But whatever we have is interesting because one of them is to turn around and say, there is no reality, there is nothing outside of this existence. When a man dies, his body, 4 people carry him in a bier, they burn him, earth returns to earth, fire to fire, water to water, and the senses vanish into space. So it's their own, which is to say that there is nothing beyond this existence. Now, from that kind of situation to the Ajivikas, who have not been studied enough understood enough in Indian history, who say we have no agency to shape our own destiny because there is this overarching thing called niyati, and niyati will determine what happens to us. So the metaphor they use is just like a ball of wool, when string, when it unwinds, will keep unwinding till you reach the other end. So also human existence will go on and on till you reach that end of the thread. Human effort is ineffectual. You can't do anything to shorten that span of lives, and you cannot do anything to lengthen that span of lives. And it includes a very amoral way in which they present, apparently amoral way in which this reality. You can walk along the left bank of the Ganga, killing and maiming people, no harm will accrue to you. You can go on the right bank of the Ganga, distributing alms and benefits, no good will accrue to you. Everyone will finally end that cycle of human existence. Now, interestingly, for the Buddha, this was the most dangerous philosophy. Not the Lokayatikas, not the Jains, because it said that we have no agency. And for the Buddha, the most important thing is that while the world is full of suffering, we have agency. And so he is extremely well shaped by historical circumstances, and he knows. So he's responding to the crisis of his own life and his own times. And he builds a philosophy which is based on effect. That is, you can control your own destiny. And your own destiny is therefore one in which you can end the world of cycle of sorrow. So that's extremely powerful. That is the human being. And there is nothing beyond. It's like the gods, and it's all there in the Buddhist folklore as it started off, or even in their texts. But the critical ideas of the Buddha are philosophical. They are not, mumbo jumbo. And that is extremely important. That was extremely important for me as a historian. And so I went for the idea of, here's this person who was thinking out of the box, clearly, but ethics is the basis of his organizing of life. And he's trying to end human suffering. Now, what can be better? So there's incredible humanity in him, in what he. So, for instance, instead of love, he has friendship as a characteristic. Metteya is very significant. So he drew my interest because, and these were all things that we did not know in the late 1970s or 80s. This kind of writing has come, much more writing has come out around the Buddha now than ever before. And I think that, and Ambedkar's own conversion has played a critical role in shaping the way you understand Buddhism. And of course, he interpreted Buddhism in his own way. But be that as it may, it was a response to the hierarchy and the inequality in caste-based Hinduism. And he took to suggesting we should Buddhism because he felt that's the only way you would be able to exit the trap of the social relations called caste. It hasn't happened, but that's what I think he was trying to search for. So it was an exciting period for me, and I did that. I actually think that intersections. I also, from after that piece of work, and I think I should only mark this point. I actually wrote another book called Rewriting History, The Life and Times of Pandita Ramabai, where I actually tried to bring some of these ideas that I was struggling with and working with to a 19th century figure. And that was my serious intervention in bringing gender into mainstream social history. And so that's a piece of work that also is came out of this larger concerns that I was having for caste, gender, and a different way of organizing society. I'm very bad at these 3 books, but I'll give you 4 or 5 books, okay? I'd like to suggest Gerda Lerner because I learned a lot from Gerda Lerner. She wrote 2 books which are called Creation of Patriarchy, the first one, which I found very powerful in my writing. But she also wrote a collection of essays which is called The Majority Finds Its Past. And I think it's really brilliant because it has essays. One of the essays is called Just a Housewife. And she describes the emergence of just the housewife, that is the non-producing woman who then concentrates only on nurturing and child rearing and looking after the domestic space, and which is a phenomenon that happens only in certain classes in the 18th, from the 18th century onwards. So, but she also wrote a wonderful essay which is called Lady and the Mill Girl. And she describes the emergence of 2 separate categories of women in the 19th century, in which some women go to work in factories and so on, and other women concentrate on reproducing the domestic sphere. So it's actually quite an interesting essay, and I like that a lot. There's a wonderful collection, which I think people should read, which early feminists, when they went back to search for rewriting history with a gender perspective, they did this oral history. And this was a group from Hyderabad, which is called the Sri Shakti Sangatana. They put together a whole series of oral interviews with women who had been involved in the Telangana struggle. And it's a fantastic collection of oral narratives called We Were Making History. And so that's something that I would suggest. Recasting woman has been very important. It has an essay by me, it has an essay by a lot of other people, and it has a marvelous introduction. So that's set in the 19th century. It unravels the women's question in the 19th century. It was edited by 2 friends of mine called Sudesh Vaid and Kumkum Sangari. So that's one. And I might add in this, I've already told you about rewriting history, the life and times of Pandita Ramabai, so I won't bring that in. But Tanika Sarkar's writing is also powerful and very significant. And she wrote a marvelous introduction to a autobiography of a 19th century woman. And the introduction is brilliant. And the story, her analysis of what appears to be an ordinary woman's reflections on her own life, setting it in a context very powerful. So it's called Words to Win. And so I would suggest that. But along with that, I would suggest also a book that Rimli Bhattacharya wrote, which was the biography of, autobiography of Binodini Dasi, an actress in the 19th century. And that also is a very powerful piece of writing, because it tells you how the underclass, even as she became very famous woman of her time, she began life as a dasi and stayed, and she was labor and prostitution is something that, or sex work, or sort of being part of the entertainment industry is all coming as a kind of package. So that's another book that I might consider adding to the list. But it's very tough to do this 3 books, 4 books kind of stuff. Okay.